Thank you for watching the Housing Oregon YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe. Slide decks from the presenters are going to be available below. Thanks for watching.
I just want to say a couple words about how we came up with our topic today. We did a project last year in Eugene, and it involved what we call tenant support, where or construction support, where a smaller construction project was happening that didn't require everyone to be moved out of the building, just a few people who couldn't function well without an elevator in place. So the elevator was getting fixed, and I had staff on site who were largely doing things like running packages and groceries up and down stairs for people who were otherwise pretty mobile. They just needed a little assistance. But when we left that project, the elevator's all fixed, it's good, everyone comes home, we think we're done. A couple weeks later, I get a phone call, and it's the client, and they say, oh, you know, after you guys left, kind of coincidentally, our property manager also had to leave for personal reasons. And when she left, the facilities manager left too. So we haven't had on-site staff. And we miss you guys. Would you consider coming back? And I was like, coming back for what? We don't do property management. And she said, oh, I know. You were just, you know, such a stable presence at the building. It was just so nice to have you there to help people out who needed help. So anyway, we ended up not going back. But I think she just needed to be talked down a little bit. She was having a moment. But my staff and I were joking amongst ourselves that what we provide is relocation and calming services to buildings. And that is partly because relocation itself is a traumatic event. So how many of you here in this room, just a little show of hands, have been through a property relocation project? Yeah, either in your life or in your work, just a couple. Okay, so for those 3 people who raised your hands, how many of you feel like it could have been done better? Oh, 2 out of 3. We see that a lot. So let's just have a little empathy exercise before we go into the rest of the presentation. Imagine that suddenly you come home one day and you find a notice on your door, and it says, you're going to have to move out sometime in the next couple of months. And this is nothing that you have asked for. What goes through your mind? What are the things that you think about? What are the possessions that you worry about? And I just want to put that in your minds so that as you listen to our presentation, maybe when we get to the end, we're going to take questions at the end. If you have questions, please hold them to the end. We'll have a few minutes for that. But maybe you'll think of some good things that haven't occurred to us. We like to think that we've seen a lot, but surprise us, please. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, just so we're all on the same page as we're talking, what is relocation? And this is just like kind of an idealized short version of what relocation is. And it is that we, Peregrine Relocations, temporarily move residents out of a building so that construction can happen at that building. And then when construction is done, we move them home. We do a lot of other things, including running groceries upstairs to people when their elevator is out of commission. But this is the short version, and it's what we do most often. We try to be flexible to our clients' needs. Next slide, please. And since we're here talking about trauma, just so we're all on the same page in terms of what a definition of trauma is, a traumatic event is one that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope. It's also, another way to think about it is as toxic stress. So you have stress, but it's extreme stress. It overwhelms. What we're going to be describing today is kind of like our usual general best practices. This is just how we function as a company, the things that we do. But when we started working on this project to give this presentation today, we all, as a group, individually went through the trainings that are online for free from Trauma Informed Oregon, which I recommend that website. I recommend that organization. Those trainings were wonderful. And they were also really reassuring to hear that we have been doing things in a trauma-informed way. So that was good. Trauma-informed Oregon suggests that we all use a broad lens to consider trauma and not be too narrow in our focus about it. So next slide, please. Just to introduce us. That's me in the upper left. I'm the owner of Peregrine Relocations, and I'm usually the first point of contact with clients, and I deal with our vendors and invoicing and contracts, and I'm usually pretty heavily involved in projects at the beginning and at the end. On the right is John Hartog. John has been with me since before the company was founded, and he is a relocation specialist and often a project lead. He's involved in helping prepare move schedules, budget tracking, attending OAC meetings, which is owner, architect, contractor, and supervising the onsite team, which today is being represented by Kelsey Villarreal and John Ross. And so Kelsey is a tenant support specialist, so her job involves coming up with an individual relocation plan for each tenant, making sure that we are on track with our URA compliance, and she'll talk a little bit more about that, but basically those are the federal HUD guidelines for the work that we do, and making sure that all reasonable accommodations are met. And then she'll work as a team with John Ross, a PAC move coordinator, and his job involves the logistics of the move. So he'll be ordering boxes, packing supplies, making sure we have inventory, handing those things out to tenants, supervising a team of packers who are the last piece of the staff that are not really represented here today, except that all of us have worked as packers in packing tenant apartments for relocation. So we're going to be talking about trauma-informed care, and what I hope that you take away from this is that it is, within our organization, it's structural. It starts at the top, and it works through all levels. Next slide, please. Okay. You're going to see a lot of slides with animals in them because we are big fans of animals. We love it when residents have pets that we can meet, and we always try to relocate the tenants with their pets. We consider those to be their nonverbal roommates. Very important, not necessarily so good at communicating their needs. We were mentored into this work in 2012 by a woman named Martha Geese. She's a writer and a civil rights activist here in Portland who did permanent tenant relocations for Northwest Pilot Project for about 15 years. And she wanted to retire, and she asked me if I wanted to learn how to do relocation, and I said yes. And so we started off at a building called the 1200 building in downtown Portland, and that was a 10-story building. The second story was all assisted living with a 24-hour nurse. But it was a temporary relocation project. And Martha had never done a temporary relocation project. And I had never done any kind of relocation project. So with her background and knowledge in permanent relocation and mine of other jobs that I've had a lot of different kinds of jobs in my life, we kind of figured some things out and made it work. And yeah, just for a moment to talk about the change in the market there. For those of you who lived in Portland in the 90s and the aughts, you may be familiar with what happened to a lot of those cute little downtown buildings that housed elderly and disabled people who were poor. They got flipped. Investors bought the building, kicked all the people to the curb, sold condos to yuppies. So this was Martha's experience, was helping those folks who had been displaced by the sale of their building. By the time she brought me on, the market changed. And so for the last dozen years, most of what we have done as Peregrine Relocations has been temporary relocation. I'm not quite sure Somebody who understands federal money maybe could explain that better. I don't quite know how that happened, but basically what we do is we help people in low-income housing while their homes are being remodeled. We do that by following URA compliance, and we hold to the spirit of the Uniform Relocation Act, even if we're working on a project that doesn't require it. And to me, that means fair compensation, reasonable, comparable housing provided, and just making sure that the tenants are being notified at all aspects of the project. Our core mission is always to care for residents as humanely as possible through the disruption of a construction project. And over the 12 years of projects that we have worked on, we've witnessed the effects of housing trauma. And our approach, as I mentioned, we were pleased to see that it aligns with trauma-informed care. Next slide, please. So maybe you've seen this bit of fun. But basically, moving is one of the most stressful things that can occur in a person's life. And it gets compounded when it becomes a move that you didn't ask for. It's up there with the death of a loved one, divorce, major illness, job loss. Relocation can be traumatic. And the question that we, as employees of Peregrine Relocation, are constantly asking ourselves is, what can we do to lessen that trauma? Lessen the impact of that trauma. This picture is one of my employees, Sage, helping out a nice lady named Marie. She moved home, and he was helping her get unpacked. Thank you. Okay, so now this slide is very busy. It's got a lot on it, and it's a lot of like detailed information that's a little bit complicated, but basically, trauma is a response that a human has to an experience that they have. And these are experiences that can be traumatic, but whether or not it's felt as trauma is dependent on the person who has the experience. It's not for us to say whether something is traumatic or not. It's the person who feels it and experiences it. I took this diagram here from a place called RISE, which is the RISE Youth Center in Richmond, California. They took this, this pyramid, which may be familiar to people who have like studied psych or behavioral health, and it starts with the adverse childhood experiences, because when you have a trauma when you're young, it imprints on you more thoroughly than it does when you're older and have developed more resilience. So if you start with an adverse childhood experience, that may lead to some impairment in your social, emotional, or cognitive processing, which can lead to adopting some health risk behaviors, some unhealthy behaviors, things like drinking and smoking, which can lead to disease, disability, and then early death. But as they love to say on the Trauma-Informed Oregon website, these things are not inevitable. This is a pyramid, not a square. There are people who are here that are doing just fine. So I don't want to talk too much about all of this, but the fun thing that the RISE group did was they changed it up a bit and included things that occur before you're born. Epigenetics, one of my favorite topics. Things that happen to your grandparents can affect your processes, can affect how you respond to things in ways that you have no idea about. Also just the social conditions that you're born into. Structural racism, things like that. Historical trauma. They also changed it so that talking about adopting unhealthy behaviors are now considered coping mechanisms. It doesn't blame the victim quite so much, which is very nice. Anyway, enough about all that. Next. Yeah, because I love a pyramid. So this one is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And what we find as relocation workers is that when we come into a project and we start talking to the residents of a building who are going to be forcibly moved without their consent, is that we are attacking the very base of Maslow's hierarchy. These are the physical needs that keep us all alive. Food, water, sleep. I love that they include justice here. But then as you go up the pyramid, you get safety, security, social needs. These things are more empowerment. And we as a company, we try to work in those realms, but we can't do any of that until we have dealt with the base. So we try to make people feel safe with us and show them that we are trustworthy, and that's a lot of our work. So we work a lot with people who have a history of housing insecurity, the formerly houseless. They will immediately become re-traumatized, feel threatened, and it's on us to help them through this process because they're going to have to move, and that's what we've been hired to help with. So yeah, we provide safety, trust, and one of the things that we see a lot is that when people, sometimes we'll get told by building managers or RSCs that some people are difficult and maybe they're just sort of angry yellers or something like that, right? But we're coming in as a blank slate and meeting them for the first time. And what we'll see is that what we're dealing with is not someone who is being willfully blocking a project, but they're dealing with a past trauma. And so it's on us to help them deal with that. I mean, we're not psychiatrists, we're not working through their childhood traumas, but we're trying to make them feel safe. One of the ways we do that is we provide agency and choice to them insofar as we are capable of doing so. So we always try to provide like a variety of housing options for people to stay at when they have a relocation coming up. And so one of the main questions we'll ask is, do you have someone you'd like to stay with? Because for a lot of folks, going home to family is going to be the best option. Like, oh, I can stay at my daughter's place. And then she'll make sure he takes his meds and eats, and sleeps, all those things. A lot of folks, they don't have that safety net, and then we work with them. We try to be that for the while that we're there, but our time on a project is short-lived. Anyway, those of you out here who do care work for a living, ask yourself the same questions that you would ask of a tenant under stress. Have you eaten? Do you need to sit down for a few minutes? How did you sleep last night? Have you been sleeping? These are questions to ask yourself and your coworkers because burnout is a real thing and you have to take care of yourself. Next slide, please. Okay, so here in a nutshell is a bunch of stuff that I have learned over the years about how to make a relocation successful. It takes time. It takes time, and it takes reassurance and trust and presence and persistence, and one size does not fit all. We'll often work with clients who say, well, we're going to put everybody in X, or we're going to do this for everybody. And what we find is that not everybody wants X. Not everybody wants this, whatever this is. And so one of the things we do is what we call, well, so A, under how to learn tenants' trust through good listening, I just have a little story to tell about that first job I had at the 1200 building. My mentor, Martha, had written up an intake form for me to do interviews with every tenant in the building. And I'm going through and interviewing this one gentleman, and he says, why do you call it an intake? And I said, I don't know. And he said, I really wish you wouldn't call it an intake. It sounds like you're checking me into a mental institution. And I said, wow, okay, I'm sorry. That was absolutely not my intent. What do you think we should call it? And he said, well, this is our first meeting. How about initial interview? And I'm like, oh, that's good, because we're going to be meeting again, and this is just the first one. So initial interview was what we've called it as a company for a long time, though we recently discovered that HUD calls it a personal interview, so we're kind of shifting over to using that language for consistency's sake. But yeah, we listen to people when they tell us things, and we believe them, take their words for it, and we understand that individuals are individuals and that not everybody is the same. We show them genuine respect because we believe that all humans deserve that. Insofar as we are capable, we provide transparency, telling people where we are in the project, what they can expect from that. And we try not to assume anything. You don't know what people are carrying. You don't know what their past experiences have been. A small percentage of the tenants always take up the majority of our services, and that's just kind of how it goes. Number 5, people are chaos. People will surprise you. That's kind of one of the things I love most about my job, is that somebody is always going to surprise me. And on our side, we're all just humans. We're doing the best we can. We try to provide accountability. If we make a mistake, we own up to it, we fix it, make amends. Small things that you do can have a big impact. Sometimes it feels like you're just pushing a rock up a hill and it keeps rolling back down on you. But in the long run, you never know what the small thing that you did that day is going to have as an impact on somebody else. And along the same lines, how you do things matters. And that goes back to showing people respect, transparency. The last two are ones that I tend to tell to my clients because they kind of need to be convinced of this. But if you can provide agency and choice to the residents of a building, that will lead them to feel like they have an investment in the project going well. Buy-in. If they have buy-in on the project, you have their cooperation. If you have their cooperation, construction moves on pace. And it's when people hunker down and try to block and stop that the construction starts to get really expensive. Also, spending a little bit more upfront can often save you money in the long run. Sometimes people will ask for things that seem kind of strange, absurd, maybe, but maybe they're not actually that big of a deal, and you can just do them. But maybe you have to ask for a couple $100s to make sure that that one thing gets done. But once you have that one person on board, everything is going to continue smoothly. Okay, now I'm going to hand it over to John Hartog, and he's going to talk about how he uses tenant-informed care, or trauma-informed care in his work.
Hello. My name's John Hartog. I've worked with Peregrine Relocations, and Larissa had mentioned since before it formed as a company. I was first hired for them as a packer, and was quickly realized on that first project how much work it was going to entail, and Larissa had been working more than 70 hours, I think, in the first couple weeks, and was like, I need help. And so I became an office manager, and then, you know, as we went along, learned new roles and what relocation was going to entail. These days, I call myself a relocation specialist, just because I've dug into the regulations and the rules enough that I can usually come up with answers pretty quickly to that sort of thing. Also, as a project lead on a lot of projects, working with along with construction and property management, coordinating the schedules, I'm sure you can imagine, important part is making sure construction goes on time. That seems like it's, one of our fundamental responsibilities is getting construction, on time without any delay because of relocation. For me, though, really having, an understanding of the schedule and being part of that conversation is critical, because I need that information to get it to the tenants and to coordinate any timing issues, that sort of thing. Another big part of our role as a relocation team is we're there to support the property managers, because on a big project like this, the resident services, they're just not equipped to handle all this extra work. It's a lot of extra work. So we're there just to kind of take that load off. So often it's kind of like, well, go to the manager's office for the usual leasing things and questions. Anything related to this relocation, you go over to this other office. And we really like to have an office on site, and we'll talk more about that, but it really makes a big difference to be able to be there on site, especially on a large project where tenants know where to find us, and we can have consistent hours. I also support our relocation team. We all wear many different hats on a project, and sometimes I'm still packing. I'm not supposed to be packing, but it just happens. It's like, oh, okay, it's time for me to pack. I always carry a utility knife and a Sharpie, just because you got to be ready to jump in. And I think probably, and of course, what this is all about is one of the most important parts is we're here to support the tenants. This usually starts off, we mentioned the initial interview, during the personal interview process, where we're getting to know the tenants and that sort of thing, and what they need, and building trust. And we always ask a tenant to give us we ask them where they came from, and it's not like, we just want to hear their story. We try to engage them in the story of, where do you come from, or what brought you to Portland, or what brought you to this building, and who's your community, and try to get just start facilitating a conversation about who they are and their story, without getting into necessarily anything personal or private. But so when I think of trauma-informed, what comes to my mind is that we're all different. We all have our own unique difficulties in our lives, and our own stress response to different things, and so it's just such a personal, individual issue. It's trauma, and it's easy to understand how during a construction project, especially when people are being forced to move, how that it's definitely going to be traumatic for some people. When we first meet tenants, one question we ask is, how does moving affect you? And we get all sorts of responses to that. But one common response we get in buildings that have seniors is, well, when I moved here, I thought this is where I didn't think I was ever going to have to move again. My whole reason I moved here was this is kind of where I was spending the rest of my life, and I never thought I'd have to experience this. That's one perspective. At a past workshop, Housing Oregon workshop, I went to the presentation was on trauma-informed architecture. And it was really interesting. And I really liked, what they were doing in this design for that the end result was going to be much better for the people who live there. However, in the whole presentation, the process was kind of glazed over. It's like, yes, and this is how it ends up. And it's like, but what about all those people that were there during the process? It's like, the relocation is traumatic. And I was thinking, well, it's like trauma-informed, doing relocation is like trauma-informed trauma. And I thought it was kind of like, we should do a presentation on trauma-informed trauma. But it's like, you know, that's kind of what it is. And our role here is to make it better. You know, you can't eliminate the trauma, but you know, you can minimize it. This slide, the elevator will be out of service. There's just little things, insights we have as a relocation team, and maybe things people don't think of, but almost on every project in a building with an elevator, that's saved as the last thing to get renovated. And there's different logic to it. It's like, well, we don't want to put all new parts and stuff in there and then just have it all scratched up and carrying heavy construction equipment and stuff through this whole project and wear out a brand new elevator. But what always happens is the elevator breaks down in the middle of the project, and then construction doesn't have an elevator, the tenants don't have an elevator. It's always on a day when we're trying to move people and our movers don't have an elevator. So I don't know. If it was done up front, maybe something could have been done to just wait till the end and install the new stainless steel finish or something. So a trauma-informed process begins with establishing a trauma-informed system, because everyone needs to play part of it for it to really work. And if we're introduced early in project planning, then we can integrate into that system and help develop good cross-team communication. And another important point is, I think all teams, it doesn't matter if you're construction, architect, or whatever, can contribute to tenant advocacy in this process. Next slide. So by the time the relocation team is brought onto a project, the big picture is already all figured out. The architects and construction team and the owners and maybe the resident services as well have come together to kind of come up with their idea of what has to happen, what the plan is. And during that early planning, like all the teams may already be working from a trauma-informed perspective with everyone in mind. The teams may already be advocating amongst themselves and as a group for the tenants. And the managers and resident services have definitely been there as a voice for the tenants on site. However, that partnership isn't whole yet until the relocation team's there also, because it's a relocation project, and that's a major component of it. By the time we come on, it's already known that this relocation is going to have to happen. It has been discussed what work can be done without relocation, what's allowed, how much can we do as occupied rehab, and then it probably comes to a point where, like, we have to move people. This is to a level where we have to move people out. And I think sometimes then, okay, that's added, but it's not always then consolidated. And I think that's a really important thing, is to avoid just having construction going on is traumatic enough. So it's important, if relocation is going to happen, to try to consolidate that work so that as much as possible can be done while the tenant's going to be out, if they have to be out anyway. Well, another thing is we've worked projects where there have to be multiple relocations. A tenant will move out for like a couple months for one part of the project, and then later on the project, it's like, oh, we just realized this is going to require relocation also, and then we'll have to move people a second time. That's the more people have to move, it's just the more traumatic it is. And so if I had to have any advice, it's like try to plan for that stuff ahead of time. These are these are the type of insights we can help with if a relocation team is brought on earlier in the process, because we've done enough of these projects, we can be like, hey, what about, and maybe people have thought about that already. It just might take, we can try to give a little more credibility to that argument of maybe spending a little more on tenant advocacy and making things go smoothly is worth it. Next slide. So I found that whether a relocation project runs smoothly or not does not seem to be correlated with the complexity of the project or the size of the project. It's rather the communication between the teams involved. By the time we get on a project, the resident services may be completely overwhelmed already. Everyone seems to be in a state of panic, and we're like, okay, we're here. Can I get a schedule? And they're like, ah. And so if the relocation team is brought on earlier, there's time to like develop these patterns of communication. And I guess I'm kind of saying this as a complaint because it's happened so many times both ways, and you can really see the difference. It's like, wow, why is everything going so smooth on this project? And it's because everyone's working together as a team, all the different teams. And other projects, you get there and you get this kind of like, oh, that's the outsiders, the relocation guys, they're here. And like, it feels like you're having to convince people and go through this process of building trust in the middle of when everything's already happening. The OAC meetings can be a good place that's owner, architect, and contractor. And these are just meetings that happen throughout a construction project, keeping tabs on how things are going on schedule and any issues that come up and that sort of thing. And on a relocation project, relocation always has a seat at these OAC meetings. I think I mentioned before, everyone is already kind of advocating for the tenants, but at these meetings, it doesn't seem like there's really a set aside like spot on the agenda for talking about trauma-informed care or the tenant's perspective. It's more like relocation. I was like, I'll talk about tenant issues, management might, but I don't know. Maybe there could be more room for that. I'm not sure. It's just an idea that to try to keep it part of the system. So good communication makes a project, a relocation less traumatic for everyone. And it allows for trauma-informed conversations about tenant advocacy. Next slide. The idea of minimizing tenant discomfort. I'm not sure where that exact term came from, but it's something that has been part of what we do for quite a while. There's federal rules that are there to minimize displacement And, part of that is taking care of people. But with relocation, minimizing tenant discomfort is like really one of our goals. It's like we know it's not going to be easy, but how can we minimize that discomfort? Some types of discomfort you see on a project, construction is disruptive. Everything's busy. There's extra noise starting early in the morning. There's smells of paint and solvents. There's all these things that make it disruptive. We have things like OSHA rules that protect the workers. But when I've had conversations where it's like, well, this is really loud, and like I get the reply like, no, we're following the rules. It's within the limits. And it's like, hold on, those limits are to protect people's hearing. That's not just what we're talking about. We're talking about disruption, these noises going all day. It doesn't matter whether it's you're going to suffer hearing loss. It's like you can't sleep, you can't think. And that's not really considered in those OSHA standards. So consideration of holidays. Almost every big project, if it's like a year-long project, at some point the construction schedule shifts constantly, but at some point it has people moving like right on Christmas, and luckily it's never actually happened. It always like whew, we dodged that bullet again, but it seems like it's always kind of in that schedule, a possibility, and it seems like that's somewhere where it could be much more, no, that's not a time to move people, because people have their decorations all set up, they have plans for family coming over, and then all of a sudden, they're like a month before it, they're like, oh, your move out time is like 2 days before Christmas. And it's like, that's what this graphic kind of represents, the sad Christmas tree going into a box. I'm not sure what can be done, but I think it can be, this is part of a conversation between the owners and the construction about, schedule. Every time you try to allow for stuff on a schedule, it costs money, but, it's worth it to help make it easier on the tenants. Because, discomfort can cause displacement. If the tenants are panicking about this and getting too upset, it doesn't matter if they've been, guaranteed and have federal rights and all this stuff that they'll get to stay there. If they feel they're getting like pushed aside, that's a real thing. It can actually cause displacement if someone just gives up and moves out because of the project. So, to minimize discomfort, the relocation team can get to know each individual tenant and build trust and understand their individual needs. That's a big part of our personal interview process. And personally, I don't know how many tenants I've met with, but we meet with a tenant for at least, we allow an hour of talking about their needs and stuff. And I try to be on any project I'm on, attend all of those meetings. We can bring our insight and our knowledge to the OAC meetings, and if we're brought on earlier in a project, bring it on early. We can make compelling requests when tenants need some sort of special accommodation. It can be difficult when the rules are set up that tenants can only get, you can't offer one tenant something that without offering it to everyone. And that's kind of that's like a rule that a lot of people stick to like a little too tightly, because temporary relocation is a temporary thing, and it requires reasonable solutions, and it requires coming up with them kind of quickly, and it's forcing tenants to jump through extra hoops so that they can get the accommodations they know they need. can actually just slow the whole project down and cause a lot more trauma. An example is like a tenant who was, was told she couldn't stay in the building in a room with grab bars because she had already an accommodation for a roll-in shower. And so she would have to go off-site and stay at this hotel, which was just the worst thing that she could imagine because she never left that building. And to do this, she ended up like talking to her. She had got back from this adventure. She's like, oh, I got my doctor's note. It was like in a heat wave. It was like upper 90s out, and she had no transportation. She was transferring buses across town. It was during a severe smoke event and in the middle of like COVID. And it's like, wow, we're making this tenant do all these things, traumatic things, so that they can get a note from their doctor. When to us, it's pretty easy to just to trust them and say, oh, yes, you think you're going to be okay for 2 months in that unit without a roll-in shower? Okay, we'll put you there. It seems reasonable to us. Anyway, flexibility is extremely important. So I should wrap this up. Basically, it takes a concerted, holistic approach to minimize trauma. I think that's the most important thing, is like every team involved has to be able to be communicating these things effectively. And one last thing I'd like to say is one thing I do enjoy doing that helps, I think, with support trauma-informed relocation is, well, when people come home, the job's not over yet. And one of my favorite things is checking in with every tenant and personally help if they can't find anything, offer to find it. People have broken and damaged things. I always want to be able to be there to spend time with tenants to make sure that that all these, we've reached a reasonable solution for them for, everything. So I'm going to hand it over to Kelsey now. Thank you.
Yep. Can you hear me through the mask? Okay. I'm Kelsey Villarreal. I'm a tenant support specialist, which means I'm a point of contact for tenants throughout a project. They have my number. They can reach out at any time. If they have concerns, emergencies that come up, reiteration of information we've given them. I'm there to answer questions and problem solve. I participate in the personal interviews or initial interviews. I do housing searches, both for temporary relocation, hotels, or sometimes apartments if it's long enough, and also sometimes for permanent relocations. And I am sort of a point person for prompt communication of schedule changes and timelines. Schedule changes happen all of the time on a construction project. So some behaviors that we see from tenants during relocation that seem to be trauma related. A lot of anxiety when they're told to move, that they will need to be moved. It is anxiety producing for everybody. Everyone's moved and it's hard. That can look like loss of sleep, needing a lot of reassurance. It can look like them verbally expressing their anxiety. A lot of people are pretty well able to communicate that. It can look like sort of furious cleaning of their apartment before we come over for a meeting or before we pack, or over apologizing for the state of their apartment. It looks often like starting a huge organizational or downsizing project like a couple days before we're supposed to pack them, which is not the time to do that. Something they've been putting off for years. It seems like the right time, but it is not. And I do think it's an anxiety response. Other behaviors, withdrawal. That can look like a tenant being really hard to get a hold of. They won't answer their phone, they won't call you back. You're trying to schedule a meeting with them and they're avoiding you, or it seems like they are. But it can also look like a tenant being very agreeable and sort of deferential to us, to sort of like slide under the radar, to not cause trouble, and they end up not communicating their needs to us or advocating for themselves. It can look like being very stubborn and particular about seemingly random stuff, even though it's not random to them, but needing things to be just so, setting time limits for like how long we can be in their apartment. So we may need to schedule a pack shorter times over more days because for some reason they don't want us in their apartment for more than 3 hours a day or something like that. It can involve like certain days being off limits. One, a sort of recent project we had a couple who really wanted to be relocated within the building, but we only had one available empty apartment to use for relocations. Everyone else was going to hotels, and that apartment was already occupied by a household from the previous phase, and there was an overlap. So we had to move out this couple before we moved the other couple home, so that empty unit wasn't available. We had a hotel across the street, still very close, but they really were adamant that they needed to be in the building. So the solution that we came up with was to put them in the hotel, but only for a couple days, long enough to move the other household back, clean the apartment, and then we moved them back to the building for most of the duration of their temporary relocation. And on the back end, we had to put them in the hotel again for a couple days and then move them home, which meant that instead of 2 moves, they had 4 moves, which for most people seems like a bigger inconvenience. But this was the solution that they were happiest with. So this is what we did. Trauma behavior, also confrontation, can be yelling, can be just sort of challenging the process a lot, every step of the process, interrogating the process or the reason for doing things or the reason for doing the project at all. You see that a lot in the beginning of a project at tenant meetings when tenants are first finding out about a project. Often they're not necessarily happy. They're worried. And then other behaviors that are not immediately recognizable to us as trauma responses. Trauma responses can look any number of different ways. So there are probably some that we've seen that we didn't recognize as trauma responses, but we try to keep an open mind about why people are acting the way they're acting. Next slide, please. Thank you. So a lot of our work falls under the guidelines of the URA, which is the Uniform Relocation Assistance and Real Property Acquisition Policies Act of 1970, or just the Uniform Relocation Act, or just the URA, which is something that provides important protections and assistance to people whose housing is affected by federally funded projects. So it governs a lot of our projects, but not all of them. But we still try to honor the spirit of the URA in non-URA projects, which means we advocate for the treatment of tenants that the URA mandates. So the same sort of tenant rights, even if it's not a federally funded project, we still ask property managers in construction to treat their tenants the way the URA would want them to be treated. So there's nothing written in the URA specifically about trauma-informed care, but there is the directive to minimize displacement, or where displacement is unavoidable, to lessen the emotional and financial impact of displacement. Displacement being someone being required to move because of the acquisition, demolition, or rehabilitation of their home or their building. Also their business. We don't handle businesses, but that's part of the definition. So a temporary relocation is not displacement. If the project involves people moving out and then they're gonna return to their like rehabilitated apartment, unless they're required to move or be in temporary relocation for longer than 12 months, then it becomes a displacement. They're offered permanent relocation benefits. They often still have the option of moving home, but different rules apply at that point. So we found trauma-informed care necessary in our work in adhering to the URA because displacement can be caused by people's trauma responses. John was talking about this a little bit. So if a tenant has not received notices in a timely manner, URA notice might be the notice of non-displacement, which is the notice that tells them that there's going to be a project happening. They may have to move temporarily, but they are not being kicked out of their house. If a tenant hasn't received that notice in a timely manner, and they've like heard through the grapevine that there's gonna be a project and they don't know there's gonna be a project, but they won't be displaced because they haven't gotten this notice, or they received the notice but it's not in their primary language, or they received the notice but there's no one there to answer questions about it and it's confusing, because it is confusing and it looks intimidating. A person who has like trauma related to a past eviction or houselessness may, receive the news that's not been clarified that there's going to be a project. They may think they're being evicted, or they may just be so panicked about it and they can't, feel like they can't go through that process again, that they just move, even to avoid the whole situation. And that's displacement. And that's what we are specifically tasked with avoiding. Other ways that people might be displaced later on in a project is if the chaos of living on a construction site, the fumes and the noise and the strangers outside your door and your window, it could cause someone with a strong enough trauma response to just abandon their housing, which we've seen once before. Next slide, please. So that's why an important part of trauma-informed tenant care during relocation is clear, timely notification and just very clear, prompt, and frequent communication with tenants about their rights, about dates and any schedule changes, their move date, where they're going. It also looks like, providing as much choice as possible. For instance, where they stay during a temporary relocation, it could involve a choice of hotels. It could involve a hotel or a family stay if they have family or friends that can host them for a couple weeks or a couple months. For a lot of people, that could be a better option. It involves the initial interview where we assess the needed accommodations of tenants related to mobility, location, and transportation. So if they are used to being able to walk to their volunteer opportunity or walk to their church, and we relocate them somewhere where it's a little too far for them to walk, how do we help them get to their regular communities? It's also where we assess tenant concerns. During the interview, we ask them, what's your biggest concern for the project, and how does moving affect you, so that we can help mitigate any of their anxieties. It looks like flexibility with meeting times and pack schedule. Does the tenant need a later start time? Are certain days off limits? If the tenant is a day sleeper, can we put them in a respite room so they can keep sleeping while we pack their apartment? We're asking so much of tenants that it's really important that we be as flexible as we can where we can. It looks like collaborating with tenant social support networks, friends, family, caregivers, and neighbors. For instance, a tenant maybe doesn't have a car, so they don't need parking at their temporary relocation housing, but maybe they do need parking because their caregiver needs a place to park. And they're part of the process because they're going to be sort of moving with the tenant because they're going to be moving or coming to work with them at a new location. It also looks like providing packing supplies in advance to tenants who want that so that they can pack important or sensitive items. Next slide, please. Whoops, okay. And yeah, I'm just reiterating what Larissa said. Shout out to Trauma Informed Oregon. We took the online trainings, which are free, and you can access them at the bottom at that link. Trauma Informed Oregon says that the difference between tolerable stress and toxic, potentially re-traumatizing stress is buffering protective relationships. That's what we try to be for tenants on a project, a stable presence to minimize stress and to avoid re-traumatizing them. I'm going to hand the mic back to Larissa now.
Okay, so just everybody wake up. We're going to make you talk amongst yourselves. So please pair up with the person sitting next to you. And thinking back to the question I asked at the beginning, if you were faced with an impending relocation of your own home and your own property, what is something that you own that you would be devastated to lose? Let's say it got broken, got lost, got stolen in the process. What is an item that means a lot to you? Please describe that to the person sitting next to you and also why it's important. But then we're going to do 2.5 minutes for each side to do their explaining to each other. So 5 minutes total to talk to each other. I will call out at the 2.5 minute mark. And then when we finish, I'll just do a quick raise of hands to ask if anybody wants to share. So 2.5 minutes, pair up, start now. If that wasn't loud enough, 2.5 minutes. Everybody switch. Okay, that's 5 minutes. So I'm going to ask somebody to please share an item that they heard about, that they were told about. If you raise your hand, please don't talk about the item that you would be devastated to lose. Talk about something that you were told about. And who wants to do it? Yeah. Here, you have to talk into the mic or they won't hear you on Zoom.
So one thing that she stressed is, family photos and important documents. So, there's some things you just can't replace. So, those are the two things that I think was most important to her.
And did she say anything about why particularly?
Well, yeah, because, the documents are, something that if you lose, she's not going to be able to get. I don't want to get personal here.
No,
Right? And so there are things that are, make her, life able to continue and go forward. So she has to have them. So it's important. And family photos,
I was talking to my coworkers up there about the thing that I would be most devastated to lose, and I'm not going to say what it was because I'm going to actually talk about what I heard, and that was a collection of family-created pottery that might be the person who made the pottery is now passed on, and so every piece that is in regular use in the home, when it breaks, it's gone and it can't be replaced. Does somebody else want to share what they heard? No? Y'all are so quiet. Okay. Oh, wait. Oh. Thank you.
I heard the thing that would be important to him is his instruments. Over the years, they've accumulated a lot of instruments, and they're very important to him. So that would be the thing that would be hard to replace. I live with a musician, and I know even though you can buy another one, there's something about the old one that you know exactly where to hit and how it feels and how it fits. And so he would miss his instruments if they were misplaced or lost.
That was beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. So I hope all of you have, I don't know, maybe just shared a little bit about the things that keep me up at night when I'm doing a relocation project. Thinking about the things that are important to people and making sure that they get home safely to them. And now we're going to pass it to John Ross to talk about PAC move coordinating and trauma-informed care.
So I'm John Ross, and yeah, I'm a PAC move coordinator, which means that I support, supervise, and supply our packing teams with the materials that they need to pack people's apartments. I also frequently attend these tenant interviews that John and Kelsey have talked about, and accompany them on unit visits so I can put my eyes on what people have and what people are like. Sometimes I'm assessing like, oh, how much packing paper are we going to need to do this salt and pepper shaker collection? Or, who do we have on staff who knows how to pack a grandfather clock? John Hartog actually is good on that one. But also, I'm also looking at interpersonal dynamics that we might, that we'll need to anticipate. And for that, if I see someone who seems to be showing a lot of anxiety of different and particular kinds, I can think about who we have on our packing team who might mesh well with them personally. And so for our packers, we're not always looking for the fastest, strongest, most efficient people. Sometimes we're looking for people that have a really gentle touch, or we like to have a diversity of interests. We kind of just attract a diversity of interests because of the nature of the work. And if we can pair, someone who's into botany with someone who has a bunch of plants, that's a great thing. Right. So we took a training, all of us, on de-escalation for librarians, which was really great. And I went looking for it the other day and I couldn't find it again, but it's worth looking for. And the guy who put on that training really likes to quote the Navy SEALs motto, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Which is all about how sometimes it's better to move slowly and smoothly and not bump up against obstacles hard. And in the end, that ends up being faster. So part of what I think the structure of our presentation has been about is how from the top down, we try to be trauma-informed in order to build space into when we have our boots on the ground. We were able to move with grace and slowly when necessary in order to not harm people and in order to keep it moving smoothly. Next slide, please. Sometimes there's no telling until the day of a pack how someone's going to respond. So even though we've done the interview with people, when we knock on their door, we might find that they're in a different state than we anticipate. And we've tried to develop skills for reading them. My favorite window into the soul of a tenant is their relationship with their pet. We often find that people will express what they're feeling inside through their pets. I remember in particular there was a woman who insisted that she was fine with the relocation. It was going to be really easy for her, but her cat was feeling really anxious. And her cat was, just kind of lolling over on his side and asking for belly rubs. And I was like, really? Is it the cat that's anxious here? And there was a couple who had a dog that they were kind of verbally abusive towards. They were always like, be quiet, behave, And the dog was pretty well behaved already. And what I came to detect was these are things that they had been told, that they had internalized. Someone had yelled these things at them. And under the stress of the relocation, they were needing to get that out of themselves somehow. So I found that when we were full of praise and affection for their dog, we were in some way helping that harmed place inside of them. So pets, but also people's objects, of course, tell a story about what's happening inside them. The tri-folded American flag in a case like that, we know the story that's there. There could be an urn beside somebody's wedding portrait, cat toys in a basket with no cat around. These are all the stories that we need to be sensitive towards, we need to be looking for, so that we don't tread on somebody's past trauma. Next slide, please. And belongings don't have to be precious necessarily in order to bear a lot of emotional weight for people. Tenants who've recently experienced houselessness, or maybe not even recently, may place an extra high value on the everyday objects that come into their orbit, because in the past they've lost everything. And so everything that they can gain now becomes, part of them in a sense, and it's an extension of their self-regard. They've lost everything. That's what landed them on the street. While they were on the street, they may have, been victims of theft or camp sweeps. And so for us to look at an apartment like this and say, you got to do something about your trash, would be incredibly insensitive. We have to treat people's objects as an extension of their self-regard. And that goes for people with hoarding issues as well. Hoarding issues may very well have trauma underlying them, and we don't know what that trauma is about. And usually when we're there, we don't have the time to really sensitively actually deal with resolving their trauma issues that underlie their hoarding. So we just have to deal with packing their stuff and making them feel okay about that and not disrespecting them. So people's stuff, people's pets, is an extension of their self-regard. Next slide. So John talking about getting in on the ground level, on the ground floor with construction, with the planning process, that's about being able to provide us with time, largely. Right, so that we can extend patience to people when we need to. Just this is a story about a tenant that we arrived at her door on her move day. So we'd packed her apartment, almost everything. Her apartment was full of stacked boxes. We'd left her with a place to sit, access to her bed, access to her bathroom, some toiletries in there. Her TV was still up, and her, her kitchen. She had her basic kitchen needs, but we'd packed a lot of her kitchen too. This was a person who had told us that she had anxiety issues and also a heart condition. And when we knocked on her door the morning of her move, anxious to get in there and wrap up those last things because the movers were coming right on our heels, she was like, I haven't slept a wink. I'm really anxious. And I'm totally amped up on coffee, and I just feel really unsteady and like I'm gonna have a heart attack, basically was how she was feeling. Will you just stand with me for a minute? And so me and another packer took her hands and did this exercise I'd learned in improv. I don't know if any of you have done improv or think that it's ridiculous but anyway, I'd learned this thing in improv where you join hands and you breathe in, just this. And you do that 3 times, and it grounds you in the moment. This is the only moment that we need to be concerned about. And at the end of that, she was like, I feel so much better. I'm gonna go sit down and put my feet up. And we were like, yeah, we feel better too. We're gonna get to work. So having the time to do that, though, it needs to be built into the process. If we've been called in on a crisis and we just have to pack people as fast as we can, we're gonna trod all over feelings like that. So slow is smooth and smooth is fast. So we also do what we call construction support for occupied rehabs, in which case tenants aren't actually relocated. They're just having to deal with construction being on site or construction coming into their unit to like replace windows. But it means that they're dealing with a torn up home in a sense. And minimizing occupied rehabs is a really good idea if it's possible. Because just having construction on site can be really disruptive to people's lives. And a story I have about that is we had a tenant, well, so there was this one morning I arrived at work. John, as usual, had set up the office that we had been provided. It was a unit, an apartment unit. He'd set up the desk opposite the door with 2 chairs in front of it. He was sitting behind the desk. Kelsey was behind the desk. And there was a tenant sitting in front of him who was just in a complete meltdown and wasn't making any real sense. She was making this grrr noise, and she was crying, she was sobbing, and she was saying, "You have to get me out of here," and doing things that we really didn't understand, like talking about bodily functions. And I just came in quietly and I took a seat too, and we just sat with her while she was going through this. And as she was able to express herself and calm down, she explained that she'd been woken by construction workers who were drilling through metal sheathing into concrete right outside her apartment, first thing in the morning. And she had a background with domestic violence and complex PTSD, and she knew this about herself, and she knew that she was having a trauma response. And she was grateful to have a space where she could come in and vent these feelings. She had gone to the construction workers to say, you know, what the hell are you doing? And but she'd been really intimidated because the foreman was this really tall guy with the really long dirty beard and really big dirty boots, and she was just intimidated by him and ran to us. And but as she calmed down, she was able to say, "I really don't think I can deal with being here while construction is happening." And we were like, "We think we can get you out for the duration of the project. It's going to take some time and some planning, though. Is there anything you can do in the meantime?" And she said, "I volunteer at a day shelter nearby. I can take more shifts there." And that's what she was able to do. She was calm by the end of this encounter. It obviously had been traumatic for her. But in the end, she was even kind of laughing about, she knew that the big construction guy wasn't so bad. He wasn't such a monster. Right, next slide. Oh, so that tenant's predicament talks about 2 things we really like to have. Respite space, which is a private room with a bathroom that's away from construction noise. And this is for tenants who are particularly sensitive and reclusive. But the other thing is common spaces and community rooms, to keep those available. Those often get shut down right at the beginning of projects, and I think it's really unfortunate because isolation magnifies trauma, and I think a lot of tenants, even who aren't necessarily that nice to each other, are often getting some kind of positive feedback from just having day-to-day contact in the common spaces that they're used to having. So if it's possible to keep common spaces available, we would definitely recommend that. When packing, if you find yourself in a position where you're having to pack people, it's important to always ensure that the tenant has a comfortable place to sit, a pathway from there to their bathroom, their bed, and their kitchen. And it's important to take breaks, not just for yourself or for your staff, but also for the tenants. Tenants often won't tell you when they're having like a physiological need for you to get out of the apartment and give them some privacy for a while. So that's really important. And that just brings us back again to time. It's absolutely the most valuable resource for us to be able to move smoothly, slowly, smoothly, which is fast. Right. I think that's it for me. Does anyone have any questions in the time remaining?
I'm part of a relocation team with IHI. How big is y'all's packing team? Is it just y'all or? Okay.
This is my admin team,
Okay.
not the packers. And we scale up or scale down depending on projects we have. We've had a dozen people working on site on a particular day for packing in the past. Just for the Zoom folk, what I said was we scale up or scale down depending on the project we're working on, and we've had as many as a dozen people working on site as packers specifically on a specific project.
At one point, we had a great team that was largely people that did roller derby. They were incredibly good packers. Yeah.
Hi. So I work at a shelter, and we are about to go begin a rehab project, and we're going to have to move everybody from the shelter to either probably another hotel motel in the area. Do you guys provide services at shelters?
We haven't done a shelter, so that's the short answer. I did write a relocation plan for a shelter in Corvallis that was going to be torn down, and my understanding was that except for a couple of people who were actual lease-paying tenants at that shelter, no one else was eligible for relocation benefits. So, yeah, I'd be happy to talk more with you about it. In order to receive the relocation benefits according to HUD regulations. And these folks were sticking to the HUD regulations. I've had other clients who say, we don't care what the regulations are, we're going to take care of everybody. And they're willing to just make sure that all of that gets folded into their loans, that they can afford to pay a relocation team to help out. And other people are like, no, bare minimum, what's the regs? We just want to do the absolute minimum.
For the relocation process, what is the ideal timeframe with interviews and everything that you do for that process?
So the question was, what's the ideal time frame for a relocation project in terms of interviews? And that's really dependent on the size of the project. So on a really large project, we will do interviews in phases throughout the course of several years sometimes. If it's a smaller project, we'll try to interview everybody up front before we start. And at least 30 days in advance, because one of the things we provide is a 30-day notice of temporary relocation. Thank you all for sharing this time with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for bringing it up.
is because I got a green chip. What color is that?
Green.
Cool. Perfect. So
Okay.
audio is fine. I'm going to leave it off just